From scattered tribes to a united people, the Iranian Plateau had finally revealed what centuries of patience had prepared. Under Cyrus, the idea of empire was born built on tolerance, balance, and respect. Under Darius, that idea was given structure, laws, roads, administration, and order stretching across continents. Persia did not rise in a moment. It rose because it remembered what others forgot, that power must be guided and conquest must be governed. Now, the empire stands vast and confident, its borders touching seas and mountains, cultures and kingdoms. But greatness invites challenge, and beyond Persia's western horizon, new rivals are watching. In the next episode, we will step into Persia at its height, the age of Darius and Cyrus, and follow the empire as it faces its greatest test against the cities of Greece. Until then, let the echoes of the plateau remind us. History moves slowly, but when it moves, it changes the world. The plateau awakens to power long after the Iranian Plateau had quietly prepared its people. The stage was set for something larger than any village, tribe, or mountain pass. The plateau, a land of memory, endurance, and quiet wisdom, was awakening to power. For centuries, its people had observed giants rise and fall. Mesopotamia's towering cities, the might of Assyria, the fleeting dominance of Babylon, and the cautious consolidation of the Medes. Each lesson was etched into the culture of the plateau, each failure and triumph absorbed like water into stone. By the early 7th century BCE, the Medes had begun to organize more formally. Ecbatana, nestled among the Zagros Mountains, became a hub of diplomacy and strategy. Here, leaders of different tribes met, not merely to debate, but to unify purpose, to coordinate for the first time on a scale beyond kinship. The tribes learned that strength alone was insufficient. Cooperation, alliances, and patience were essential. Meanwhile, the Persians occupied the southern lands of Perses. Though smaller in numbers, they were growing quietly, absorbing administrative knowledge from older civilizations. They observed the Medes, learning how to govern without destroying tribal identities, and how to balance local autonomy with centralized authority. They were students of power, refining their vision for the future. The plateau itself demanded this careful approach. Its mountains provided defense, but its valleys and rivers were pathways for opportunity or invasion. Communities could not simply act without foresight. Geography enforced strategy, just as morality guided leadership. As Assyria weakened under repeated campaigns, and Babylon struggled with internal unrest, the plateau's people began to see a world ready for new power. Opportunity arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly, but the Iranian tribes were ready. They had patience, knowledge, and centuries of cultural and spiritual guidance behind them. Among the Medes, leaders emerged who understood both tradition and innovation. They respected elders and tribal customs, but also coordinated armies and settlements in ways that previous generations had only imagined. Military strategy became more organized, diplomacy more sophisticated. It was a delicate balance between strength and restraint, ambition and caution. Trade and communication across the plateau improved. Routes connected Persis to the Zagros to Mesopotamia and to distant lands beyond the mountains. Goods moved, ideas traveled, and with them, a sense of identity began to solidify. The Iranian peoples were no longer isolated. They were part of a wider, interconnected world. Yet, despite these developments, the plateau's people remained humble in their rise. They did not yet seek conquest for glory. They sought stability, unity, and preparation, lessons learned from observing both the successes and the catastrophes of neighboring giants. The ethical and spiritual teachings that had taken root centuries before, the respect for truth, order, and responsibility, guided these early decisions. Leadership was expected to be fair, alliances honored, and power exercised with care. It was this combination, geographic advantage, ethical grounding, observational wisdom, and cautious organization, that distinguished the plateau from other powers. Here, patience was a strategy. Restraint was a virtue. Foresight was as important as military skill. By the end of this period, the Iranian Plateau had quietly transformed. It was no longer merely a place of memory and survival. It was becoming a power in its own right. The Medes, with their growing influence, and the Persians, with their careful observation and administrative learning, were poised to step beyond tribal unity. The stage was set for a new chapter, one where leadership would consolidate, empires would form, and history would take notice. The plateau had learned to survive among giants. Now it was ready to stand among them, and soon, from this careful preparation, the rise of Persia would begin, an empire built not only on conquest but on centuries of enduring observation and ethical leadership. The mountains of the Iranian Plateau had long been a refuge for tribes and clans, a place where people learned to survive, endure, and remember. Yet by the early 7th century BCE, something remarkable was happening. The scattered tribes of the Medes were beginning to unite, slowly and deliberately, under leaders who understood the lessons of the plateau and the world beyond. For generations, the Medes had lived in relative isolation. Each clan had its own customs, its own territory, and its own elders. Decisions were local, immediate, and personal. Leadership was earned through respect, courage, and wisdom, not inherited through power alone. Yet the plateau itself demanded more. Surrounded by larger civilizations, Assyria to the west, Urartu to the north, Babylon to the south, fragmented tribes could survive, but they could not thrive or shape history. The early Median leaders understood this. They were students of geography, culture, and strategy. They observed the rise and fall of Mesopotamian cities, the brutal efficiency of Assyrian armies, and the resilience of neighboring peoples. They knew that unity did not require erasing individuality, but rather creating alliances strong enough to protect, organize, and influence. The first step was communication. Tribal leaders sent envoys to neighboring clans, not to demand submission, but to build trust. Shared ceremonies, trade exchanges, and festivals created bonds that were both social and political. Around fires in the highlands, elders and warriors met, sharing stories of survival, learning, and ethical governance. These gatherings were not mere ritual, they were early councils of what would become a unified Median state. Military organization followed naturally. While the tribes had always been capable of defending themselves, coordinated action on a larger scale was new. Leaders began organizing joint patrols along mountain passes, pooling resources and manpower. Scouts traveled along trade routes, observing movements of neighboring kingdoms and nomadic groups. Strategy replaced improvisation. The Medes learned to fight not as isolated tribes, but as a network of allied communities capable of decisive, organized action. This unification was guided by more than mere survival instincts. The Iranian ethical framework, nurtured for centuries through spiritual thought and Zoroastrian influence, emphasized truth, order, and responsibility. Leaders were expected to act ethically, not only toward their own people, but also in diplomacy with neighbors. Alliances were sacred. Betrayals were costly in more than blood. These principles became the invisible glue holding the Medes together as they grew in strength. By the late 7th century BCE, the unification of the Medes was no longer theoretical. They established Ecbatana as a central hub for leadership and governance. Its location, nestled among the Zagros Mountains, was both strategic and symbolic. From here, tribal leaders could coordinate trade, diplomacy, and military strategy. Ecbatana became a place where ethics met pragmatism, where power was exercised with both wisdom and foresight. Yet the Medes were cautious. They knew the surrounding giants were formidable, and premature aggression could be disastrous. Instead, they focused on consolidation, observation, and readiness. Their armies were trained, their councils refined, and their alliances strengthened. Even as Assyria began to weaken, the Medes acted with care, ensuring that they would be prepared when the time to rise came. The plateau itself seemed to guide this process. Its mountains offered natural protection, its rivers sustained communities, and its valleys created pathways for trade and diplomacy. The geography, combined with centuries of cultural memory, gave the Medes a subtle advantage. They were patient, yet poised, ready to act decisively when opportunity appeared. By uniting, the Medes demonstrated a profound lesson of the plateau. Survival alone is insufficient. Influence requires coordination, ethics, and strategic patience. Tribal identities were preserved, but a larger sense of purpose emerged. The Medes were no longer a collection of isolated clans. They were a people learning to govern themselves, preparing for a future that would soon include Cyrus, the unifier of Persia. Their rise also sent ripples across the region. Neighboring tribes and smaller kingdoms observed the Medes' growing organization. Some sought alliances, others braced for potential conflict. The plateau, once quiet and overlooked, had begun to assert itself. Its people were no longer merely surviving. They were shaping the balance of power. In this delicate period, the Medes learned the art of timing. They understood when to negotiate, when to prepare for conflict, and when to expand influence quietly. This was the foundation of a political culture that would later characterize the Persian Empire. Action grounded in preparation, guided by ethics, and informed by observation. And so, as the tribes of the Medes united, the Iranian Plateau moved from centuries of preparation into a new chapter, one of organization, strategy, and rising influence. The stage was set for the emergence of Persia. The people of the plateau had learned how to stand among giants, and the world would soon notice. The slow unification of the Medes was a quiet revolution, one without banners or immediate conquest, but one that laid the ethical, cultural, and strategic foundations for history's first great Persian empire. By the late 7th century BCE, the ancient world was changing. The once mighty Assyrian Empire, which had terrorized the lands from the Tigris to the Mediterranean, was no longer invincible. Generations of expansion, endless campaigns, and internal unrest had left it weakened. This decline created an opportunity for the people of the Iranian Plateau, especially the Medes, who had spent centuries learning patience, strategy, and governance. Assyria's strength had long been legendary. Its armies were disciplined, its cities fortified, and its kings ruthless. Yet empires, like rivers, wear down over time. The Assyrians had overextended themselves, fighting campaigns across Babylon, Phoenicia, and beyond, while trying to control distant vassals. Rebellions stirred in the west, supply lines grew thin, and political instability began to fracture the empire from within. The Medes, now unified under a growing central authority in Ecbatana, observed carefully. They did not rush to attack or claim glory. Instead, they sent scouts, gathered intelligence, and formed alliances with neighboring peoples who were equally wary of Assyrian domination. Their leaders understood a crucial principle. Power comes to those who are prepared when opportunity arises. Babylon, long a rival and occasional vassal of Assyria, had also begun to weaken. Internal disputes over succession and the ambitions of regional governors created openings for influence. The Medes saw a world in which old giants were faltering, and a smaller, well-organized power could step in not just to survive, but to reshape the regional balance. Diplomacy became as important as military strength. The Medes negotiated with neighboring tribes and kingdoms, offering protection, trade agreements, and shared intelligence. They cultivated loyalty through ethics as well as force, guided by principles inherited from centuries of Iranian spiritual and cultural thought. Truth, order, and moral responsibility were more than abstract ideals. They were tools for political stability. Meanwhile, trade routes across the plateau and beyond became conduits of influence. Merchants carried not only goods but information, alliances, and subtle signals of the Medes' growing power. The Persian tribes in the south, observing and learning from these developments, began to adapt similar strategies. Knowledge of administration, diplomacy, and military organization spread quietly but steadily across the plateau. By now, Ecbatana was not merely a city. It was a center of strategy. It hosted councils, housed emissaries, and coordinated patrols and defenses. The Medes had become a force to be reckoned with, but they remained patient. They knew the fall of Assyria would not happen overnight. Instead, they positioned themselves to act decisively when the moment was right. And that moment did arrive. Internal strife, rebellions in Mesopotamia, and famine in parts of Assyria created a perfect storm. The Medes, allied with Babylonian forces, struck with precision, combining diplomacy, strategic sieges, and calculated military campaigns. The old empire, exhausted and fractured, could not respond effectively. What had once seemed invincible fell, not in a single dramatic battle, but through years of careful preparation and strategic patience. This was a lesson that would echo throughout Persian history. Empires are won as much by wisdom and timing as by swords and armies. The Iranian Plateau had learned that lesson over millennia, and now it was being applied on a regional scale. With Assyria's collapse, the Medes emerged as a dominant power in the Near East, respected and feared in equal measure. The surrounding kingdoms Urartu, Babylon, and smaller vassal states now had to contend with a unified Iranian force capable of diplomacy, administration, and military action. The plateau's centuries of preparation had borne fruit. Yet even in this success, the Medes remained cautious. They were aware that power without vision could crumble. And in the south, the Persian tribes continued their quiet development, learning the strategies, ethics, and governance that would soon allow them to rise under a new leader, one who would unite the plateau like never before. By the end of this era, the Medes had demonstrated the full power of patience, observation, and preparation. Assyria had fallen, Babylon had survived only partially, and the Iranian Plateau had stepped fully into history. The stage was set for the next great chapter, the rise of Persia under Cyrus the Great, where the lessons of the plateau, the Medes, and centuries of cultural memory would culminate in one of history's first true empires. The world was changing, quietly but profoundly, and the Iranian Plateau was no longer just a witness. It had become an actor, deliberate, strategic, and ready. While the Medes were rising to power in the north, the southern lands of Persis, the heartland of the future Persians, were quietly building their own foundations. Though smaller in population and influence than the Medes, the Persians were patient observers, absorbing knowledge, learning administration, and preparing for the moment they would step onto history's larger stage. Persis was a land of gentle plains, rivers, and ancient settlements. Its people had lived in the shadow of Elam for centuries, inheriting lessons in governance, urban organization, and trade. Even after Elam's decline, the structures of cities like Susa and the surrounding villages left traces of administrative wisdom. The Persians studied these systems, not simply to imitate, but to adapt them to their own tribal communities, blending tradition with practicality. Unlike the Medes, who had unified through alliances and councils, the Persians were still tribally organized, with each clan maintaining a degree of autonomy. Yet there was an awareness that the world was shifting, that larger powers required coordination. They began to develop networks of loyalty, subtle agreements of cooperation, and shared knowledge of agriculture, taxation, and resource management. Trade routes through Persis carried goods and ideas from Mesopotamia to the plateau, connecting Persian settlements to the wider Near East. Through this exchange, the Persians absorbed lessons in diplomacy, commerce, and governance skills that would later prove invaluable under unified leadership. Cultural blending was also key. The Persians were influenced by the Medes to the north, by Elamite administrative practices, and by interactions with neighboring peoples. Language, ritual, and moral frameworks spread quietly across the region, giving the Persians a sense of identity grounded in both ethics and practicality. The values of truth, order, and responsibility, cultivated over centuries, informed the development of leadership principles. Even as local chieftains held power, they understood the importance of fairness, loyalty, and cohesion within the tribe. This preparation was not only administrative or cultural, it was strategic. The Persians learned from the Medes' successes and failures. They watched how alliances were formed, how military campaigns were coordinated, and how diplomacy could prevent unnecessary conflict. They understood that real power was not just about conquest, but about preparation, observation, and timing. By this time, some Persian tribes were beginning to consolidate more formally. Emerging leaders recognized the benefits of unity without destroying traditional autonomy. They began forming councils and early networks of cooperation, setting the stage for a more centralized Persian leadership. Military organization, while not yet as sophisticated as the Medes, began to take shape, with scouts, patrols, and small, disciplined units learning the terrain and defending tribal territories. The environment itself shaped Persian growth. Rivers provided fertile land and trade opportunities. Mountains offered protection and strategic vantage points. The Persians understood that geography could be both shield and challenge. They integrated this understanding into their planning. Settlement patterns, military strategy, and governance reflected the landscape's opportunities and constraints. By the late 7th century BCE, the Persians had built a foundation that would allow them to step onto the world stage. They had learned from the Medes, observed the rise and fall of surrounding powers, and absorbed centuries of local wisdom. What they lacked in immediate size or force, they compensated for with preparation, ethical leadership, and careful strategy. It was in these quiet years that the future Cyrus, who would unite the Persians and ultimately challenge the Medes, began to rise. He was nurtured in a culture that valued moral guidance, strategic observation, and patience. Every interaction, every lesson from the Medes, every story of the plateau is a long memory shaped him into a leader capable of extraordinary vision. The Persian foundation was not a sudden innovation. It was the culmination of centuries, a careful blending of Elamite administration, Median strategy, tribal loyalty, and plateau-born ethics had created a people ready for empire. And so, while the Medes had already claimed dominance over the northern plateau, the south quietly awaited its moment. The stage was nearly set for a union of north and south, for a leader to emerge who could consolidate the Iranian Plateau, extended influence across Mesopotamia, and ultimately found the first great Persian empire. The rise of Persia was not merely about force. It was about preparation, understanding, and timing, lessons that had been centuries in the making. From Persis to Ecbatana, the Iranian Plateau was ready. The Medes had unified. The Persians had prepared. And soon, one leader would emerge to bring them together and step into history. Among the Persian tribes of Persis, in a land quietly preparing for greatness, a boy was born who would change history. His name was Cyrus, though in these early years he was known simply as a member of a noble tribe, observed and nurtured under the watchful eyes of elders and family. From birth, his life was shaped by the lessons of the plateau, lessons in patience, observation, and ethical responsibility, and by the knowledge passed down from centuries of preparation. Cyrus grew up surrounded by stories of the Medes and the Elamites, of distant empires, and the rise and fall of kings. He learned that power without wisdom was fleeting, and that leadership required more than courage or strength. He was taught the principles of truth and order, ideals drawn from the spiritual and cultural frameworks of the plateau, values that would guide him throughout his life. These early teachings instilled in him a sense of responsibility, that a ruler's duty was not only to his tribe, but to justice, loyalty, and the welfare of all people under his care. The young Cyrus observed the Medes to the north, whose unity and growing strength were both impressive and instructive. He noted how alliances were formed, how councils made decisions, and how armies moved with precision. He understood that leadership was not simply inherited or seized by force. It required planning, observation, and strategic patience. Even as a boy, he displayed a remarkable awareness of both his own people and the broader political landscape surrounding Persis. Education in the Persian tribes was not formal in the way of distant cities, but it was profound. Cyrus learned horsemanship, archery, and the arts of survival in the mountains and plains. He trained with the elders in governance and ethics, and he studied the patterns of nature, the seasons, and the land itself, lessons in observation that were as important as lessons in war. The Iranian Plateau had long taught its inhabitants that understanding one's environment was as crucial as knowing one's neighbors. As Cyrus Grey, he became a natural leader among his peers, yet he was not hasty or arrogant. He understood that patience was often the most powerful weapon. He listened more than he spoke, studied more than he acted, and gained respect through fairness as much as through skill. In him, the Persian values of morality, prudence, and foresight were embodied in one young figure. But the world was changing. The Medes had grown in strength and influence, holding sway over much of the plateau. Persis, though prepared, remained a smaller power. Cyrus understood that his people could not simply challenge the Medes outright without careful planning. He needed alliances, timing, and strategy, a combination of force and subtlety. His early life, shaped by plateau wisdom and tribal guidance, had prepared him for exactly this challenge. Stories from elders emphasized the importance of ethical leadership. A ruler who gained loyalty through fear alone would never create a lasting foundation. Cyrus internalized this principle deeply. He sought to earn allegiance through fairness, vision, and respect, knowing that true power was not merely physical or political, but moral and cultural as well. By the time Cyrus reached young adulthood, his reputation had begun to spread. He was recognized as a figure of potential, a future leader capable of uniting tribes, and asserting influence across the plateau. His charisma was quiet, yet commanding. His strategy was subtle but decisive. He embodied the lessons of generations: preparation, observation, and ethical leadership. Cyrus's vision extended beyond Persis. He imagined a world where the Iranian Plateau could be united, where diverse peoples could coexist under just governance, and where the mistakes of overambitious empires could be avoided through wisdom and foresight. It was a vision rooted not in conquest alone, but in order, fairness, and long-term strategy, the principles that had guided the plateau for centuries. In these early years, the foundations for Persia were being laid not in battlefields or palaces, but in the mind, character, and observation of a young leader. Cyrus would grow to unify the Persian tribes, challenge the Medes, and establish a state that combined centuries of preparation into an empire the world had never seen. For now, though, he was still learning, still observing, still preparing. The Iranian Plateau, patient and enduring, had found its leader. And soon, the quiet foundation of Persis would give rise to the first great Persian Empire, one that would echo across centuries and continents. As Cyrus grew into adulthood, the Persian tribes of Persis were ready to act. The lessons of the plateau had been long and deliberate: patience, observation, and preparation. Now, the time had come to test those lessons, and the young leader would move with both caution and determination. The Medes, though powerful, were not invincible. Their dominance over the plateau had been earned through unity and alliances, but with size came complexity. Tribal loyalty was strong, but subtle divisions and distant territories created opportunities for those with vision and strategy. Cyrus understood that brute force alone would not suffice. He needed alliances, planning, and moral legitimacy. The early rebellion was neither sudden nor reckless. Cyrus began by quietly securing the loyalty of Persian clans, emphasizing fairness, shared purpose, and the long-term benefit of unity. He reminded them of the centuries of preparation that had brought them here, the administrative knowledge inherited from Elam, the strategic patience learned from observing the Medes, and the moral principles passed down through generations. Every decision was deliberate. Every step was measured. Diplomacy became as important as the sword. Cyrus sent envoys to neighboring tribes, forming alliances and negotiating mutual support. He cultivated trust, demonstrating that loyalty to him would not demand submission without reciprocity. The Persians were learning, under Cyrus's guidance, that power built on respect and ethical leadership was more enduring than power won by fear alone. Meanwhile, scouts and spies provided intelligence on Median movements and vulnerabilities. Cyrus understood the terrain intimately. Mountains, passes, rivers, and valleys were all part of his strategy. He knew where to advance, where to defend, and where to wait. Preparation and timing became as important as the size of his forces. The rebellion unfolded gradually. Small skirmishes, carefully placed demonstrations of strength, and strategic maneuvers signaled the Persians' growing power without provoking premature retaliation. The Medes, though dominant, underestimated the growing unity and discipline of the Persians. Cyrus used this to his advantage, consolidating power in southern Persis while maintaining the moral and political legitimacy needed to gain allies among other tribes. Cyrus also emphasized governance. Even in these early campaigns, he treated captured towns with fairness, upheld agreements, and avoided unnecessary bloodshed. This approach not only secured loyalty but also strengthened his reputation as a leader of justice and foresight, a principle rooted in the ethical teachings of the plateau. The Persian tribes, once loosely connected, were now forming a cohesive network. They shared resources, coordinated military movements, and established communication channels that allowed rapid response to changing circumstances. Cyrus's leadership transformed a collection of clans into a politically organized and strategically capable force, ready to challenge the Medes directly when the moment was right. This period of rebellion and preparation was not merely military. It was also cultural and psychological. Cyrus nurtured a sense of shared identity among the Persians. They were no longer just individual clans or families. They were part of a larger story, one that would unite the plateau under a single vision. The ethical and moral principles cultivated for centuries, truth, order, responsibility, became the guiding framework for every action. By the end of this stage, Cyrus had accomplished what few young leaders could. He had transformed the Persian tribes into a disciplined, loyal, and ethically guided force, ready to challenge Median dominance. The rebellion was not reckless or chaotic. It was the result of centuries of preparation, observation, and patient strategy. Cyrus had internalized the lessons of the plateau. Timing, foresight, and ethical leadership were more powerful than any army alone. The world was watching quietly. The Medes, strong but complacent, were about to encounter a force that had learned not just to survive, but to plan, persuade, and conquer wisely. Cyrus's rebellion was the first step toward uniting the Iranian Plateau, a prelude to the emergence of Persia as a cohesive empire. From these carefully orchestrated beginnings, Cyrus would rise, and the First Persian Empire would emerge not as a sudden conquest, but as the culmination of centuries of preparation, patience, and ethical leadership. The stage was set for the final consolidation of power, and the plateau was ready to step fully into history. For centuries, the Medes had been the dominant power of the Iranian Plateau. They had unified tribes, coordinated armies, and established Ecbatana as a seat of influence. Yet, even the strongest empires have vulnerabilities, and the patient preparation of the Persians under Cyrus was about to exploit them. Cyrus, now a capable and respected leader, had carefully nurtured loyalty among the Persian tribes. He had observed the Medes, studied their governance, and understood the subtle fractures within their network of alliances. Where the Medes relied on their size and past dominance, Cyrus relied on strategy, timing, and ethical leadership. The first step was subtle. Rather than launching a rash attack, Cyrus strengthened ties with Median vassals and neighboring tribes who had grown dissatisfied with centralized control. He promised fairness, protection, and recognition of local authority. Many who had once submitted to the Medes quietly began to shift their allegiance. The Persians, guided by Cyrus, were careful to present themselves not as conquerors, but as units. Military maneuvers followed. Small, disciplined Persian units began securing controlling trade routes, and establishing fortified positions. Cyrus's strategy was precise: isolate Median strongholds, disrupt communication, and encourage defections among less loyal vassals. Unlike the Medes, who relied heavily on traditional displays of force, Cyrus blended diplomacy with calculated action, creating a network of influence that extended across the plateau. The fall of the Medes was not the result of a single battle, but of years of preparation and subtle strategy. As Persian power grew, the Median leaders found themselves overstretched and increasingly unable to manage distant territories. Internal divisions weakened their authority, and the loyalty of vassals became uncertain. The same patient observation that Cyrus had honed over decades now became decisive. When the moment came, it was swift and deliberate. Persian forces, coordinated and disciplined, advanced strategically, seizing key cities and passing Median defenses. Togstrung could not withstand the combination of planning, speed, and psychological strategy employed by Cyrus. The collapse was almost inevitable, a testament to the careful preparation that had taken generations to achieve. Cyrus's leadership was characterized by restraint and justice. Captured cities were treated with fairness. Local leaders who submitted peacefully retained positions of influence. This approach secured loyalty and minimized resistance. It was an early demonstration of a principle that would define Persian governance for centuries. Power could be maintained through fairness as well as force. The fall of the Medes marked more than a shift in political control. It was the moment the Iranian Plateau transitioned from centuries of preparation into a unified Persian state. Cyrus had demonstrated that leadership required not only courage and skill, but ethics, strategy, and vision. The Medes, once the giants of the plateau, had been replaced not by chaos, but by a carefully organized and morally guided power. This unification was also symbolic. It bridged the northern and southern parts of the plateau, connecting Median administrative knowledge with Persian preparation and ethics. For the first time, the Iranian Plateau had a cohesive leadership capable of influencing the wider Near East. The stage was set for expansion, diplomacy, and the foundation of what would become the first great Persian empire. Cyrus's consolidation of power was swift yet deliberate. He avoided unnecessary destruction, respected local customs, and established a system of governance that balanced central authority with local autonomy. This approach ensured stability and built trust, a key reason why the Persian state could endure and expand in the years to come. By the end of this chapter in history, the Medes were no longer the masters of the plateau. Cyrus, the young leader nurtured by centuries of ethical and strategic preparation, had united the Persian tribes and established a foundation for empire. The Iranian Plateau, patient and enduring, had found its voice and its leader. The rise of Persia was no longer a distant possibility. It was a reality that would soon echo across the Near East and beyond. The fall of the Medes was not merely a military conquest. It was the triumph of preparation, observation, and moral leadership. The Iranian Plateau had learned to survive among giants, and now it was ready to lead them. With the Medes subdued and the Iranian Plateau unified under a single vision, Persia finally emerged as a cohesive power. Cyrus, now firmly established as the leader of both Persis and the former Median territories, faced the monumental task of transforming disparate tribes into a functioning state. What had once been small, isolated communities now formed the foundation of a nascent empire. The first priority was administration. Cyrus adopted lessons from Elamite governance, Median organization, and tribal councils, blending them into a system that balanced central authority with local autonomy. Provinces retained some self-governance, but loyalty to the Persian crown was enforced through careful oversight, ethical leadership, and the cultivation of trust. This allowed for rapid consolidation without unnecessary rebellion, and the people began to see Persia as a stable, fair, and orderly state. Military organization was equally important. Cyrus established disciplined units, trained in both defense and strategic offense, capable of coordinating across the plateaus, mountains, rivers, and valleys. Rather than relying on sheer numbers, the Persian forces emphasized training, observation, and tactical planning. A reflection of the lessons learned from centuries of plateau survival and the rise of the Medes. Even in times of expansion, the military served as a stabilizing force, protecting trade routes, maintaining security, and supporting governance. Trade and communication flourished under the emerging Persian state. Routes connecting the plateau to Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and beyond allowed goods, ideas, and cultural influences to flow freely. Persis, once the quiet land of preparation, became a hub of connection, where merchants, diplomats, and travelers exchanged knowledge and experience. This integration strengthened both the economy and the cultural identity of Persia, preparing the empire for interaction with the wider world. Cyrus also prioritized ethical leadership and justice as the cornerstone of his rule. He believed, as the plateau had taught, that power exercised through fear or oppression was fragile. Instead, he rewarded loyalty, respected local traditions, and treated conquered peoples with fairness. This approach not only secured stability, but created a model for governance that would endure for generations. Persia's emergence was not merely political or military. It was cultural and psychological. The unification of tribes, the integration of Median administrative knowledge, and the adherence to ethical principles fostered a sense of shared identity among the people. They were no longer just Persians or Medes. They were members of a larger vision, a cohesive Iranian state capable of influencing the broader Near East. Neighboring kingdoms observed the rise of Persia with curiosity, respect, and caution. Babylon, Lydia, and other regional powers recognized that a new player had emerged, one that combined strategic wisdom, disciplined organization, and moral governance. Persia had become a state not only capable of defending itself, but also prepared to extend influence beyond its borders. By now, Cyrus had established a foundation for long-term expansion. The Iranian Plateau, nurtured over centuries, had produced a leader capable of transforming preparation into action. The moral, cultural, and strategic lessons of the past were now embodied in the governance of Persia, creating a state that could endure and thrive. The emergence of Persia marked a turning point in history. The plateau, once quiet and overlooked, had become a center of power, strategy, and influence. Cyrus's leadership ensured that the new state would not merely survive. It would shape the course of the Near East, setting the stage for future conquest, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. And so, Persia emerged fully disciplined, united, and ethically guided. It was an empire built not just on conquest, but on centuries of preparation, observation, and wisdom. From the mountains of Ecbatana To the plains of Persis, the Iranian Plateau had become a force to be reckoned with. Cyrus had achieved what no previous leader had: the unification of the plateau under a vision of justice, order, and strategic foresight. The foundation was secure, the people loyal, and the empire ready to face the giants beyond its borders. The stage was now set for Persia to extend its reach, and for the world to take notice. From the plateau to Mesopotamia, Persia was poised to write the first great chapter of its imperial story. The emergence of Persia did not go unnoticed. Across the Near East, neighboring kingdoms and empires watched with a mix of curiosity, caution, and concern. Babylon, once a mighty empire in its own right, observed the unification of the Iranian Plateau with guarded interest. Lydia to the west, a wealthy kingdom known for trade and strategic skill, began to consider how Persia's rise might alter the balance of power. Even smaller kingdoms and tribes bordering the plateau took note, recognizing that a new player had arrived. One disciplined, organized, and ethically guided. The reaction of these powers was not uniform. Some saw opportunity, others saw threat. Babylon, facing internal unrest, began to negotiate cautiously with Persia, seeking alliances where possible to safeguard its own stability. Lydia sent envoys, probing the intentions of Cyrus and the newly united Persian tribes. Diplomatic channels became as important as military strength, reflecting a world in which influence and negotiation were often as decisive as swords. Cyrus, aware of these reactions, acted with calculated foresight. He knew that premature aggression against powerful neighbors could jeopardize the stability he had carefully built. Instead, he focused on consolidating loyalty within Persia, securing trade routes, and reinforcing the ethical foundations of governance. Persia's strength, he understood, was not only in armies, but in trust, administration, and strategic positioning. The Medes, now integrated into the Persian state, remained a critical component of this strategy. Former Median territories provided natural defense, administrative knowledge, and military experience. Cyrus treated Median leaders with respect, incorporating them into the Persian governance system. This approach minimized resistance and created a cohesive, multi-ethnic state capable of both stability and expansion. Across the plateau, Persia's influence began to extend beyond its borders. Small neighboring tribes voluntarily aligned themselves with Persia, attracted by its reputation for fairness and stability. Merchants and envoys carried news of Persian organization and leadership to distant cities, enhancing the state's prestige and soft power. This quiet but effective expansion set the stage for greater campaigns to come, demonstrating that empire could be built through diplomacy as much as war. Military preparedness continued in parallel. Cyrus organized units capable of rapid mobilization, trained to respond to both defense and strategic offense. Scouts monitored the movements of Babylonian forces, Lydian traders, and northern nomadic tribes. Preparation was meticulous, every action deliberate. Persia had learned from centuries of observation. Timing and planning were as decisive as brute strength. The reaction of surrounding powers also revealed a subtle truth. Persia's rise was moral as well as political. Conquered and allied peoples alike noted that Cyrus governed with fairness, honored agreements, and respected local customs. This ethical approach reduced the likelihood of rebellion and encouraged loyalty, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond what armies alone could achieve. As Persia grew in reputation, some neighboring rulers attempted to form coalitions to resist it. Yet Cyrus's careful diplomacy, combined with strategic displays of power, often neutralized these threats before they could materialize. Persia became known not as a brash conqueror, but as a wise, measured, and formidable force, a model of leadership that balanced strength with justice. By the end of this period, the Iranian Plateau had fully stepped onto the world stage. Cyrus's vision was clear: a unified Persia, ethically guided, strategically organized, and capable of influencing the balance of power across the Near East. The stage was set for larger campaigns, for the expansion of influence into Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and beyond. Persia was no longer a regional power. It was a rising empire, poised to reshape the political landscape of its time. The lessons of the plateau, the Medes, and centuries of preparation had culminated in a state capable of both stability and expansion. Cyrus's Persia was ready to assert itself, but it would do so with the careful planning and ethical governance that had distinguished the Iranian Plateau for generations. The world was beginning to take notice, and the first true Persian Empire was on the horizon. With the Medes integrated, the Persian tribes unified, and surrounding powers aware of its growing influence, Persia entered a period of full consolidation under Cyrus the Great. The Iranian Plateau, once a land of scattered tribes and cautious preparation, had become a state capable of organization, governance, and strategic expansion. Cyrus now faced the challenge of transforming Persia from a regional power into an enduring empire. The first step was governance. Cyrus established a system that balanced central authority with local autonomy. Provincial leaders retained some decision-making power, while loyalty to the crown ensured unity and order. This careful approach minimized resistance, fostered cooperation, and allowed Persia to function efficiently across diverse territories. It was governance that drew upon centuries of knowledge, lessons from Elamite administration, Median organization, and the ethical traditions of the plateau. The Persian military also became a model of disciplined coordination. Units were organized not merely to fight, but to protect trade routes, enforce laws, and support diplomacy. Training, observation, and strategic deployment were emphasized over sheer numbers. Reflecting the centuries of careful preparation that had preceded Persia's rise, Cyrus understood that lasting power required more than conquest. It demanded structure, foresight, and adaptability. Culturally, Persia flourished. The integration of Median traditions, local Persian customs, and ethical guidance fostered a shared identity. People began to see themselves as part of something greater than their tribe or city-state. Loyalty was cultivated through fairness, justice, and respect, not fear. It was a model of empire that combined strength with morality, a principle that would define Persian governance for generations. Diplomacy continued to play a crucial role. Babylon, Lydia, and neighboring kingdoms observed Persia's rise with renewed caution. Cyrus sent envoys and negotiators to maintain alliances, prevent conflicts, and create a network of influence across the Near East. Trade routes flourished, bringing wealth, ideas, and cultural exchange. Persia's reputation grew not only as a military power but also as a state of stability, justice, and strategic wisdom. The plateau itself remained central to Persia's identity. Its mountains provided natural defense. Its rivers supported agriculture and trade. Its valleys offered pathways for movement and communication. The geographer that had shaped Persia's ancestors now guided the empire's growth. Cyrus understood that the land, like its people, demanded respect and careful stewardship. By the end of this period, Persia had emerged as a dominant regional power. The Iranian Plateau had been transformed from a collection of tribes and kingdoms into a cohesive state capable of influencing the balance of power in the Near East. Cyrus had achieved what generations of preparation had intended: a united Persia, strong, ethical, and strategically positioned. The first great Persian empire had taken shape. It was a state built not on fleeting conquest, but on patience, preparation, observation, and moral governance. The world had taken notice, and the Iranian Plateau had fulfilled its centuries-old promise. It was now a player on the stage of history. As Persia looked beyond the plateau, the stage was set for further expansion, diplomacy, and cultural achievement. Cyrus's vision of unity, fairness, and strategic foresight would guide the empire as it grew to encompass Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and lands far beyond. From the quiet preparation of ancient tribes to the rise of one of history's most enduring empires, Persia had come of age. The Iranian Plateau had done its work. For centuries, it had shaped minds through hardship, patience, and observation. Now, under Cyrus, it had produced something rare in history, a ruler who did not rush power, but understood it. Persia was unified. The Medes were integrated. The tribes were loyal. The land was stable. And so, naturally, the world beyond the plateau began to matter. Cyrus understood a truth that many kings never grasped. An empire does not expand because it desires conquest. It expands because its borders touch instability. To the west lay Lydia, wealthy, confident, and ruled by King Cyrus. To the east, nomadic peoples tested Persia's frontier strength. To the south and west, Babylon stood ancient, rich, and internally fragile. Persia could not remain still. Stillness, on the world stage, invited danger. But Cyrus did not march blindly. He paused, he observed. He listened. Messengers returned from foreign courts. Merchants spoke of roads, defenses, rivalries. Diplomats brought whispers of alliances and fears. Cyrus gathered knowledge the way earlier Persians had gathered patience. This was not the beginning of conquest. It was the beginning of measured expansion. The philosophy of expansion. Cyrus did not see foreign lands as enemies by default. He believed order was preferable to chaos, and just ruled better than cruelty. If a neighboring kingdom governed poorly, oppressed its people, or destabilized the region, it posed a threat not only to itself, but to Persia as well. This belief did not make Cyrus gentle. It made him precise. Persia would expand where stability was absent, where injustice bred unrest, where alliances threatened the balance of the region. This mindset would define the Persian Empire. The first choice, Lydia. Among all neighboring powers, Lydia stood out. It was wealthy beyond comparison. Its capital, Sardis, glittered with gold. Its king, Croesus, was confident. Perhaps too confident. Croesus viewed Persia as new, untested, and vulnerable. He believed Cyrus could be checked early, before Persia became unstoppable. And so, Lydia made the first move. Croesus sought alliances with Babylon and Egypt, hoping to encircle Persia. He consulted oracles, interpreted signs, and convinced himself that victory was assured. But Cyrus had already anticipated this. Persian scouts watched Lydia's movements. Diplomats understood Croesus's intentions before his armies ever marched. The plateau had taught Cyrus a critical lesson. Those who rush usually reveal themselves first. Before a single Persian soldier crossed a border, Cyrus strengthened the core. Supply lines were organized, provincial leaders were instructed, local governance was secured so rebellion would not erupt during absence. This was not the behavior of a warlord. It was the behavior of a state builder. The army itself was carefully assembled. Not enormous, but disciplined. Persian forces moved with coordination, adaptability, and restraint. They did not rely on terror. They relied on control. When Cyrus finally marched west, it was with calm certainty. The army did not rush. It advanced deliberately, securing terrain, protecting logistics, and maintaining morale. Local populations watched with curiosity. These were not invaders who burned villages indiscriminately. They paid for supplies. They enforced discipline. They punished looting. Stories spread ahead of the army. Persia's king was different, and stories in the ancient world traveled faster than armies. As Persia moved toward Lydia, neighboring powers adjusted their calculations. Some prepared defenses. Others hesitated, unsure whether Persia was threat or opportunity. Cyrus had achieved something remarkable before a single decisive battle. He had changed expectations. Empires were used to brutality. They were not used to discipline guided by ethics. This difference would become Persia's greatest weapon. The crossing into Lydia marked more than a military campaign. It marked Persia's transition from regional power to imperial force. The Iranian Plateau had given Cyrus strength. Now, the wider world would test it. And in that test, Persia would reveal a new model of empire. One built not merely on conquest, but on order, foresight, and legitimacy. The road ahead would be long. Battles would come. Cities would fall. But the foundation was solid, and the world was about to learn the name of Cyrus the Great. By the time Cyrus began moving west, King Croesus of Lydia had already made his decision. Lydia was one of the wealthiest kingdoms of the ancient world. Its gold flowed from the Pactolus River. Its capital at Sardis was fortified and prosperous, and its armies were experienced. Croesus believed wealth, allies, and tradition placed him among the great powers of his age. But what troubled him was Persia. To Croesus, Persia was still new, a rising power without long imperial history. The Medes had fallen quickly, and that worried him. New powers were unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Croesus believed that if Persia was not stopped early, it would soon become unstoppable. So Croesus chose offense over patience. Before moving his armies, he sought legitimacy. In the ancient world, Wars were often justified not only by politics, but by divine approval. Croesus consulted famous oracles, including Delphi, asking whether he should attack Persia. The response, famously ambiguous, suggested that if he crossed the river Halys, a great empire would fall. Croesus believed the oracle referred to Persia. It did not occur to him that the empire in danger might be his own. With confidence reinforced, Croesus began forming alliances. He reached out to Babylon and Egypt, hoping to create a coalition strong enough to contain Persia. On paper, the plan looked sound. Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt together represented immense wealth and military power. But distance, timing, and mistrust weakened the alliance before it could act. Cyrus, meanwhile, watched carefully. Persian intelligence networks had improved significantly since the unification of the plateau. Scouts, traders, and diplomats carried information across borders. Cyrus learned of Croesus's intentions long before the Lydian army began its march. Instead of rushing to confront him, Cyrus waited. He allowed Croesus to commit first. In the ancient world, the side that moved first often revealed its weaknesses. Croesus crossed the Halys River and entered territory that had once belonged to the Medes and now lay under Persian influence. By doing so, he turned his campaign from a defensive measure into an invasion. Dis materit. It allowed Cyrus to present himself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of stability and order. As Croesus advanced, he captured cities and consolidated his position, expecting Cyrus to respond slowly. He assumed Persia was still organizing, still learning, still inexperienced. This was a miscalculation. Cyrus mobilized rapidly, but not recklessly. Persian forces moved in coordinated units, maintaining supply lines and discipline. Instead of charging directly towards Sardis, Cyrus focused on positioning, cutting off routes, and understanding Lydian movements. The two sides eventually met near the city of Tyria. The battle was intense and inconclusive. Both armies fought hard, neither gaining a decisive advantage. As winter approached, Croesus made a critical decision. Believing the campaign season was over, he withdrew to Sardis, confident that he could regroup, summon allies, and resume the war in spring. This decision would cost him everything. Cyrus did not follow the traditional rules of seasonal warfare. Instead of withdrawing, he pursued. Persian forces moved with speed and determination, crossing vast distances in conditions most armies avoided. Croesus, believing himself safe behind Sardis's defenses, was caught unprepared. The sudden appearance of the Persian army shocked Lydia. Sardis was strong, but not invulnerable. Cyrus laid siege, and within weeks, Persian forces breached the city. The fall of Sardis was swift and decisive. Croesus, once the richest king in the world, was captured. What followed demonstrated why Cyrus's reputation spread so rapidly. Croesus was not executed. Instead, he was spared, treated with respect, and later even consulted as an advisor. This act was unprecedented in a world where defeated kings were often killed or humiliated. The message was clear. Persia did not destroy for the sake of destruction. It absorbed, stabilized, and governed. The fall of Lydia sent shockwaves across the Near East. A kingdom long considered untouchable had collapsed with stunning speed. Its allies hesitated. Babylon and Egypt, seeing what had happened, delayed action. No one wanted to face a power that combined speed, discipline, intelligence, and restraint. Persia had just defeated a wealthy, established empire, not through overwhelming force, but through timing, strategy, and leadership. Cyrus had proven that Persia was no longer simply rising. It had arrived, and the world was beginning to understand that this new empire did not fight wars the old way. It fought them better. The fall of Sardis was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological shock that rippled across the ancient world. For generations, Lydia had been a symbol of wealth, stability, and power. Its kings were famous, its gold legendary. If such a kingdom could fall so quickly, then no power could afford to ignore Persia any longer. News traveled fast along trade routes and diplomatic corridors. Merchants carried the story east and west, envoys whispered it in royal courts. Soldiers repeated it in camps and cities. Cyrus had defeated Lydia in a single campaign season, and he had done it without unnecessary destruction, Cities under Persian control were not burned. Temples were respected. Local officials who cooperated were allowed to remain in place. Life, for many ordinary people, continued with surprising normalcy. For the ancient world, accustomed to brutal conquest, this was unsettling. Persia was not behaving like previous empires. The Lydian aftermath after Sardis fell, Cyrus faced a choice. He could rule Lydia directly with Persian officials, or he could preserve existing structures and integrate them into the empire. Cyrus chose integration. Lydian administrators, artisans, and military leaders were retained. Taxes were standardized rather than increased arbitrarily. Trade routes remained open. Lydia's famous economy was not destroyed. It was absorbed. This approach strengthened Persia immediately. The empire gained wealth, skilled labor, and access to the western trade networks of Anatolia. More importantly, it gained a reputation. Submission to Persia did not mean ruin. Croesus himself became a living symbol of this policy. His survival demonstrated that resistance did not automatically lead to death, and cooperation could lead to dignity. Other rulers took note. A chain reaction begins. The fall of Lydia triggered a chain reaction across the region. Greek cities along the western coast of Anatolia, many of which had been under Lydian control, now faced a decision. Some submitted peacefully. Others resisted, uncertain whether Persian rule would preserve their autonomy. Cyrus did not rush. He sent administrators, not just generals. Agreements were negotiated. Garrisons were placed carefully. Rebellions were addressed selectively, not indiscriminately. This was expansion, but controlled. Meanwhile, neighboring powers reassessed their strategies. Babylon, watching from the south, grew increasingly uneasy. Internally, it was already strained by political division and unpopular rule. Persia's victory over Lydia made one thing clear. Babylon would eventually face Cyrus. Egypt, distant but attentive, began strengthening its defenses and reconsidering its alliances. The balance of power in the Near East had shifted. Why Persia's victory mattered. Lydia had fallen before, but never like this. Previous conquerors ruled through fear. Cyrus ruled through predictability and structure. People knew what to expect under Persian authority, and uncertainty, the greatest fear of conquered populations, was reduced. Persia did not erase identities. It organized them. This approach allowed Cyrus to expand without exhausting his resources or provoking endless revolts. Each conquest strengthened the empire rather than weakening it. It also revealed something important. Persia's strength did not lie solely in its army. It lay in administration, discipline, and legitimacy. These qualities were rare. The empire's shape becomes clear, with Lydia secured. Persia now stretched from the Iranian Plateau to the edge of the Aegean world. This was no longer a regional kingdom. It was an empire spanning cultures, languages, and economies. Managing such diversity required skill. Cyrus relied on local knowledge while enforcing imperial standards. Tribute was collected efficiently. Justice was administered consistently. Roads and communication improved. The empire began to function as a connected system, not a collection of conquered lands. This system would soon be tested again. The world adjusts for smaller states and cities. The lesson was clear. Resisting Persia brought risk. Cooperation brought stability. Some rulers sent envoys offering allegiance without battle. Others delayed, hoping Persia would stop expanding. But Cyrus had learned that pause, not aggression, invited danger. The empire had momentum, and beyond Lydia lay the oldest and richest prize of all. Babylon. The fall of Lydia had opened the western gate of empire. Now the southern gate stood in Cyrus's path, a new standard of power. By the end of this phase, Persia had done something unprecedented. It had proven that an empire could expand rapidly without collapsing under its own weight. That victory did not require destruction. That authority could be established through structure and restraint. The ancient world was beginning to understand that Persia was not simply another conqueror. It was something new, and Babylon, ancient and proud, would soon be forced to respond. By the time Cyrus turned his attention toward Babylon, the ancient city was already uneasy. Babylon was not just another kingdom. It was one of the oldest centers of civilization in the world, a city of immense wealth, deep tradition, and powerful symbolism. Whoever controlled Babylon inherited more than land. They inherited authority in the eyes of the ancient Near East. But beneath its grandeur, Babylon was vulnerable. Its current ruler, Nabonidus, was unpopular. He had spent long periods away from the capital, neglected traditional religious duties, and alienated powerful priesthood. Many within the city felt disconnected from their king, uncertain of his leadership, and frustrated by his policies. Cyrus understood this. Persian intelligence did not focus solely on walls and armies. It focused on people, politics, and morale. Cyrus knew that Babylon's strength on the surface concealed deep internal fractures. He did not rush. He prepared, understanding Babylon before confronting it. Babylon's defenses were legendary. Massive walls, fortified gates, and the Euphrates River running through the city made a direct assault costly and uncertain. Many rulers before Cyrus had respected these defenses and avoided confrontation. Cyrus chose a different approach. Instead of threatening Babylon openly, he positioned himself as a legitimate alternative to not. Through diplomacy and messaging, Cyrus emphasized his respect for local traditions, religious institutions, and existing social order. He did not promise destruction, he promised restoration. This message reached Babylonian priests, administrators, and city elites. Many began to view Persian rule not as invasion, but as an opportunity to remove an unpopular king. The march south. When Persian forces moved toward Babylon, they did so methodically. Cities along the way were secured with minimal resistance. In Manikas's gates were opened voluntarily. This was not coincidence. Cyrus's reputation now preceded him. The fall of Lydia had demonstrated that submission did not mean ruin. People understood that Persia brought stability rather than chaos. As the Persian army advanced, Babylon faced a difficult reality. Its external defenses were strong, but its internal unity was weak. The fall without destruction. When the Persians reached Babylon, they did not launch a dramatic assault. Instead, Cyrus employed strategy and timing. The Euphrates River, which flowed through the city, became the key. Persian forces diverted the river upstream, lowering the water level within the city. This allowed troops to enter Babylon without breaching its massive walls. The city fell with remarkably little fighting. Babylon was not burned. Its population was not massacred. Temples were protected. The city's infrastructure remained intact. For an ancient capital of such importance, this was extraordinary. Cyrus enters Babylon. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a ruler. He presented himself as chosen by the city's gods to restore order and justice. Religious rituals were respected. Priests were reinstated. Traditional practices resumed. This approach secured immediate legitimacy. Babylonians did not experience conquest as catastrophe. Many experienced it as relief. Nabonidus was removed from power, and Babylon became a central administrative hub of the Persian Empire rather than a ruined prize. Why Babylon changed everything. The capture of Babylon transformed Persia from a powerful empire into the dominant power of the Near East. With Babylon came wealth, bureaucracy, cultural prestige, and control over major trade networks. Persia now ruled lands that had shaped civilization itself. More importantly, Cyrus demonstrated a new model of imperial rule. Empires before him ruled by fear. Cyrus ruled by integration. He allowed conquered peoples to maintain identity, religion, and local leadership while enforcing imperial stability. This reduced rebellion and increased loyalty. It also allowed Persia to expand faster than any empire before it. A message to the world. The fall of Babylon sent a clear message to every kingdom, city, and tribe across the ancient world. Persia could defeat the strongest fortresses. Persia could manage the most complex societies. And Persia could do so without destroying what it conquered. This combination was unprecedented. The empire now stretched from the Iranian Plateau through Mesopotamia to Anatolia. Its borders touched Egypt, Central Asia, and the Greek world. Persia was no longer reacting to threats. It was defining the age. The empire's identity takes shape. With Babylon secured, Cyrus's vision was fully realized. An empire built on discipline, justice, and structure. An empire that valued stability over terror. An empire that ruled people, not ruins. The greatest prize of the ancient world had fallen. not in flames, but in order. And the consequences of that moment would echo for centuries. With Babylon under Persian control, Cyrus faced a challenge no conqueror before him had handled successfully: how to rule a vast and diverse population without constant rebellion. Most empires relied on fear. Cities were punished, peoples were displaced, religious traditions were suppressed or ignored. These methods worked in the short term, but they created resentment that eventually tore empires apart. Cyrus chose a different path. Rather than imposing uniformity, he introduced a policy that would redefine imperial rule in the ancient world: governance through respect and restoration. A new approach to rule. Cyrus understood that stability did not come from domination alone. It came from legitimacy. To gain that legitimacy, he allowed conquered peoples to maintain their customs, laws, and religious practices. Local administrators were often kept in place, provided they pledged loyalty to the Persian crown and upheld imperial order. This approach sent a powerful message. Persia did not exist to erase cultures. It existed to organize them. Cities that cooperated were rewarded with protection, trade access, and internal autonomy. Those that resisted faced discipline, but even then punishment was measured rather than indiscriminate. The goal was not terror. The goal was permanence, religious freedom as policy. One of the most striking aspects of Cyrus's rule was his attitude toward religion. Instead of favoring a single cult or suppressing others, Cyrus recognized the political and social importance of local religious traditions. Temples were repaired. Priesthoods were restored. Religious festivals resumed. In Babylon, this was especially significant. Cyrus presented himself as a ruler who respected Babylonian gods and traditions, which helped him gain acceptance among the population. This policy extended across the empire. People worshipped as they had before. Now, under Persian protection, the return of displaced peoples. Perhaps the most famous example of this policy was Cyrus's decision to allow displaced communities to return to their homelands. Previous empires had used forced resettlement as a tool of control. Cyrus reversed this practice. Peoples who had been removed from their lands were permitted to return, rebuild, and govern themselves under Persian authority. This act had profound consequences. It reduced unrest. It rebuilt economies. And it created loyalty. People did not see Persia as an oppressor, but as a liberator. Administration over oppression. Cyrus also reformed how taxes and tribute were collected. Instead of arbitrary demands, tribute was standardized and predictable. This allowed local economies to function without constant disruption. Trade expanded, and prosperity followed stability. Persian officials monitored governance, but they did not micromanage daily life. As long as order was maintained and obligations were met, local systems remained intact. This administrative restraint made the empire manageable, even as it expanded rapidly. Why this policy worked? Cyrus's approach succeeded because it aligned with the realities of empire. An empire built on fear requires constant force. An empire built on cooperation requires structure and trust. Persia chose the second path. The combination of military strength, administrative efficiency, and cultural respect created a system that absorbed new territories rather than exhausting itself controlling them. This model would influence empires for centuries. The reputation of Cyrus grows. Stories spread far beyond Persian borders. Cities learned that surrender did not mean destruction. Priests learned their traditions would be protected. Rulers learned that cooperation offered survival. Cyrus's name became associated with justice as much as power. This reputation became one of Persia's greatest strategic advantages. Many regions submitted without battle simply to avoid chaos and gain stability. The shape of empire is set. By the end of this phase, Persia was no longer just large. It was organized. Its empire functioned as a network rather than a chain. Its authority was enforced, but not oppressive. Its diversity was managed, not erased. Cyrus had achieved something extraordinary. A multi-ethnic empire that worked. And yet, challenges remained. Beyond Babylon lay Egypt, to the north and east. Nomadic threats tested borders. In the west, Greek cities watched nervously. Persia's system would soon face new tests. But its foundation was strong. A lasting legacy begins. Cyrus's policies marked a turning point in world history. For the first time, empire was defined not only by conquest, but by governance. This was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of preparation on the Iranian Plateau. Patience, observation, and restraint brought to scale. Persia was no longer learning how to rule. It was teaching the world how empire could endure. Borders, battles, and the edge of the known world. By the time Persia had secured Babylon and stabilized its western territories, the empire had reached a size no previous power had managed to control so effectively. Yet expansion brings new challenges. As borders stretched farther from the Iranian Plateau, new threats emerged, not from wealthy kingdoms, but from lands beyond settled civilization. To the east and northeast lived nomadic peoples, skilled horsemen who moved freely across open steppe. To the south lay Egypt, protected by deserts and river barriers. These regions did not fit neatly into Persia's existing model of expansion. Cyrus understood that borders were not simply lines on a map. They were zones of constant tension, requiring vigilance, diplomacy, and, at times, force. Securing the eastern frontiers, the eastern territories of the empire were vast and difficult to control. Sparse populations, harsh landscapes, and mobile tribes made traditional administration ineffective. These groups did not live in cities that could be captured or governed. Instead of large-scale conquest, Cyrus adopted a strategy of containment. Persian forces secured key routes, established fortified positions, and negotiated agreements with local leaders. Where cooperation was possible, it was encouraged. Where raids threatened stability, swift military responses followed. The goal was not complete domination, but stability. This flexible approach prevented the empire from becoming overstretched, while ensuring that trade and communication remained secure. War at the edges, not all encounters were resolved peacefully. Some nomadic groups resisted Persian influence, testing the empire's resolve. Cyrus responded with calculated campaigns designed to deter further aggression rather than destroy entire peoples. These campaigns were dangerous. Fighting mobile enemies in unfamiliar terrain required adaptability and restraint. Persian forces learned to fight beyond cities and walls, applying discipline even in unpredictable conditions. Victory, when achieved, reinforced Persia's authority along its borders. The Egyptian question. Egypt remained the most significant unaddressed power near Persia's borders. Rich, ancient, and strategically protected, Egypt had avoided direct confrontation with Cyrus so far. Its rulers watched Persian expansion closely, strengthening defenses and weighing their options. Cyrus did not rush south. He understood that Egypt required careful planning. The deserts surrounding it, limited movement, and the Nile defined both its economy and defense. For now, Cyrus focused on consolidation rather than immediate conquest. Persia was strong, but strength unused was often safer than strength overextended. The limits of expansion. As the empire grew, Cyrus became increasingly aware of its limits. Every new territory required administration. Every new border required defense. Every victory carried long-term responsibility. Cyrus resisted the temptation to conquer for conquest's sake. His campaigns were strategic, not impulsive. This restraint preserved the empire's internal stability, even as its reputation grew. The weight of leadership. By this stage of his rule, Cyrus was no longer simply a conqueror. He was the guardian of an enormous system. Decisions now affected millions of people. Success depended not only on victories, but on sustainability. Cyrus relied heavily on trusted advisors, regional governors, and local leaders. Delegation became essential. Authority was shared, but accountability remained firm. This balance allowed the empire to function across vast distances. The human cost of empire, despite Cyrus's restraint, expansion was never without cost. Soldiers died far from home. Communities faced disruption. Borders remained volatile. Cyrus did not ignore these realities. His policies aimed to minimize suffering, but they could not eliminate it entirely. This awareness shaped his later decisions, reinforcing his preference for diplomacy where possible and force only when necessary. An empire at its edge. By the end of this period, Persia had reached the edge of the known world, as it was understood at the time. From Anatolia to Mesopotamia, from the Iranian Plateau to Central Asia, the empire stood unmatched. Yet Cyrus knew that no empire could expand forever. Stability, not size, was the true measure of success. A king nearing the end, Cyrus had achieved what few rulers in history ever would. He had built an empire that functioned. He had ruled diverse peoples with relative peace. He had changed the meaning of conquest, But his journey was not yet complete. One final campaign remained, one that would test both his leadership and his legacy. The death of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the First Persian Empire. His end is as fascinating and debated as his monumental life. Cyrus wasn't just a conqueror, he was a revolutionary. He founded the Achaemenid Empire, which became the largest empire the world had ever seen. From the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus River, his rule was defined by something radical for its time: tolerance and respect. When he conquered Babylon, he didn't pillage and burn. Instead, he famously freed the Jewish people from captivity, allowing them to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. This act, recorded in the Bible, cemented his legacy as a just and merciful ruler. The Cyrus-Ilian, an ancient clay artifact, is considered by many to be the world's first charter of human rights, declaring freedom of religion and abolishing forced labor. He was a king who built bridges, not just walls. But how did such a powerful figure meet his end? This is where history turns into a puzzle. There isn't one single accepted story. The most famous and dramatic version comes from the Greek historian Herodotus. He tells a tale of Cyrus's final campaign against the Massagetae, a fierce nomadic tribe from the steppes of Central Asia, led by the warrior Queen Tomit. According to Herodotus, Cyrus first tried to win by trickery. He proposed marriage to Queen Tomyris, but she saw through his political maneuvering and rejected him. Undeterred, Cyrus invaded her lands. Initially, he set a trap. He left a camp filled with wine and fine food, feigning a retreat. The Massagetae, led by Tomyris' son, Cambyses, found the camp, indulged in the wine, a drink they weren't used to, and were easily captured. When Cambyses sobered up and realized his dishonor, he took his own life. This enraged Queen Tomyris. She sent Cyrus a chilling message, vowing to quench his thirst for blood. A brutal, epic battle followed. Herodotus describes it as the fiercest conflict ever fought between non-Greek peoples. In the end, Cyrus's mighty army was defeated, and he himself was killed. True to her word, Queen Tomyris found Cyrus's body on the battlefield. She had his head cut off and plunged into a wineskin filled with human blood, proclaiming, "I warned you I would quench your thirst for blood, and so I shall." It's a gruesome, powerful story of a queen's revenge and a conqueror's fall. But is it true? Many historians are skeptical. Herodotus loved a good story, and this one is almost too cinematic. It perfectly fits the Greek theme of hubris, of a great man brought down by his own pride and ambition. Then we have another version, from a different Greek historian, Xenophon. His account is completely different. Xenophon was a great admirer of Cyrus, and wrote a book called which is more of a philosophical biography than a strict historical text. In Xenophon's telling, there's no dramatic battle, no warrior queen, no bloody revenge. Instead, Cyrus the Great dies peacefully of old age in his capital city. He gathers his sons and advisors around his deathbed, delivering a final, wise speech about the nature of the soul, the importance of unity, and the succession of his kingdom. It's a dignified, serene end, fitting for the enlightened ruler Xenophon wanted to portray. So, we have two completely opposite accounts: a violent death in battle versus a peaceful death at home. Which one is right? A third historian, Ctesias, offers yet another possibility. He claims Cyrus died from a wound he received while fighting the Darbases, another Central Asian tribe, assisted by Indian allies with war elephants. In this version, he's mortally wounded but makes it back to camp, where he settles his affairs before passing away. This account sort of bridges the gap between the other two, a death related to battle, but not quite as dramatic as Herodotus's version. So, what's the truth? We'll likely never know for certain. The lack of Persian sources from that exact time leaves us relying on Greek writers, each with their own biases and narrative goals. Herodotus wanted to tell a thrilling moral tale. Xenophon wanted to present an ideal monarch. But what we do know for sure is the legacy Cyrus left behind. His tomb still stands today in Pasargadi, in modern-day Iran. It's a simple, yet majestic structure. It's said that Alexander the Great, another legendary conqueror who came centuries later, visited this very tomb. He was a huge admirer of Cyrus, and was dismayed to find it had been looted. He ordered it restored and punished those responsible. This act shows the immense respect Cyrus commanded, even long after his death, from one of history's other giants. Cyrus's empire would last for another 2 centuries, shaping the course of Western and Eastern civilizations. His ideas on governance, human rights, and multiculturalism were ahead of their time and continued to inspire leaders today. Thomas Jefferson, one of America's founding fathers, owned 2 copies of Xenophon's Cyropedia and drew inspiration from its depiction of Cyrus as an ideal ruler. So, while the details of his death remain shrouded in mystery, the impact of his life is crystal clear. Cyrus the Great wasn't just a king who built an empire of land. He built an empire of ideas. An empire founded on the principle that true power lies not in oppression, but in magnanimity and freedom. Whether he fell in a blaze of glory against a warrior queen or passed away peacefully surrounded by his family, Cyrus's story teaches us that how a person lives is far more important than how they die. His legacy is not in his final battle, but in the world he created. Cyrus was the Great, the legendary founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. But what happened after Cyrus? How did this colossal empire, the largest the world had ever seen, continue to thrive and eventually fall? Today, we're picking up where we left off, diving into the dramatic history of the Persian Empire after its founder. After Cyrus's death in 530 BC, the throne passed to his son, Cambyses II now. Cambyses had some big shoes to fill, and he was determined to prove himself. His most famous achievement, the conquest of Egypt. He marched his army across the treacherous Sinai Desert and, in 525 BC, defeated the Egyptian forces at the Battle of adding the ancient land of the pharaohs to the Persian domain. But Cambyses' reign was short and troubled. While he was away in Egypt, a usurper named Gamata, who claimed to be Cambyses' long-lost brother Bedia, seized the Persian throne. Hearing this news, Cambyses rushed back to reclaim his empire, but died on the way under mysterious circumstances. With the empire in chaos, a distant relative of the royal line stepped into the spotlight. His name was Darius I, later known as Darius the Great. Along with 6 other Persian nobles, Darius overthrew the usurper Gamata and took the crown for himself. But his fight wasn't over. Rebellions erupted across the empire, from Babylon to Media. Darius spent the first few years of his reign crushing these revolts, and he made sure everyone knew about his victories. He had them carved into a giant cliffside inscription, the Behistun inscription, which became our key to deciphering ancient cuneiform script. Once peace was restored, Darius proved to be a genius administrator. He was the ultimate organizer. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a governor or He standardized weights, measures, and coinage, introducing the gold daric, which facilitated trade across his vast realm. He also built the Royal Road, a highway stretching over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis, complete with rest stations. A message could travel its entire length in just 7 days. An incredible feat of communication for the ancient world. Darius also commissioned the construction of the magnificent city of Persepolis, a ceremonial capital designed to wow visitors with the power and wealth of Persia. But Darius's ambition didn't stop at his borders. He expanded the empire eastward into the Indus Valley and westward into Europe. His European campaign led to the famous Greco-Persian Wars. It all started when Greek cities in Ionia, which was under Persian rule, revolted. Athens sent ships to help them. Darius was furious. In 490 BC, he launched an invasion of mainland Greece to punish Athens. But his forces were famously defeated at the Battle of Marathon. It was a shocking setback, but not the end of the story. Darius died before he could launch another invasion, so the task fell to his son, Xerxes I. Xerxes amassed one of the largest armies of antiquity and, in 480 BC, marched on Greece. You've probably heard of the legendary stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. While the Persians won that battle, their navy was later smashed at the Battle of Salamis. The following year, the Persian army was decisively defeated at Plataea, forcing Xerxes to retreat. The dream of conquering Greece was over. The defeat in Greece marked a turning point. While the Persian Empire remained a superpower for another century and a half, the era of constant expansion was largely over. The reigns following Xerxes were marked by palace intrigues, assassinations, and rebellions. Kings like Artaxerxes I and Darius II spent much of their time dealing with internal conflicts, particularly in Egypt, which repeatedly fought for its independence. The empire was still immensely powerful and wealthy, often playing Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta against each other by funding their endless wars. Persian gold was as mighty as a Persian army. The final chapter of the Achaemenid Empire began in 334 BC. A new power had risen in Greece. Macedon, led by a brilliant young general named Alexander the Great. Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with a mission to conquer the Persian Empire. The reigning Persian king, Darius III, was a capable ruler, but he was no match for Alexander's military genius. In a series of stunning battles, Granicus, Issus, and finally Gaugamela, Alexander shattered the Persian armies. Darius III fled and was eventually assassinated by one of his own sons. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great entered Babylon as the new ruler of Asia, bringing the magnificent Achaemenid Persian Empire to a dramatic end. But the legacy of Cyrus and his successors endured. The Persian model of a tolerant, multicultural empire connected by roads and a common administration influenced countless civilizations, including Alexander's own Hellenistic kingdoms and, later, the Roman Empire. They set a standard for what an empire could be. Crisis, rebellion, and the limits of power by the middle of Cambyses II's reign, the Persian Empire appeared larger and stronger than ever. Yet beneath this surface of control, tensions were growing. Empires expand faster than they stabilize. The wider Persia stretched, the harder it became to govern from a single center. Distance, communication delays, and local ambitions began to test the limits of imperial authority. The age of effortless conquest was ending. The problem of distant Persia now ruled lands separated by deserts, mountains, and seas. Orders issued from the royal court could take weeks or months to reach distant provinces. By the time instructions arrived, conditions on the ground had often changed. This created space for uncertainty and opportunity. Local leaders gained influence. Regional identities remained strong. Loyalty depended increasingly on competence rather than fear. The empire still functioned, but control was uneven. Rumors and uncertainty during Cambyses' long absence in Egypt. Rumors spread across the empire. Some questioned whether the king was still alive. Others doubted his ability to rule from so far away. Old rivalries resurfaced. In the ancient world, uncertainty was dangerous. Where authority appeared distant or distracted, rebellion became possible. And rebellion did come. Challenges from within several regions began to resist Persian authority. Some claimed excessive taxation. Others objected to foreign officials. A few simply sensed weakness and most dangerous of all were challenges that claimed legitimacy. Rebels did not always oppose the empire openly. Instead, they presented themselves as rightful rulers, local kings, or heirs of ancient dynasties. This undermined Persian authority not through force alone, but through symbolism. The role of identity. Persia ruled a multicultural empire, but identity still mattered. People did not see themselves as Persians. They saw themselves as Egyptians, Babylonians, Medes, or Elam. Cyrus had managed this diversity carefully. Cambyses struggled to maintain the same balance. When local traditions felt threatened or ignored, loyalty weakened. The empire was not breaking apart yet, but the cracks were visible. Power without presence, one of Cambyses' greatest challenges, was absence. He ruled from afar. He relied on reports. He depended on officials whose loyalty could not always be guaranteed. Without direct presence, authority became abstract. Governors gained autonomy. Military commanders gained influence. Central control weakened. This was not a failure of intelligence or effort. It was a structural challenge of ruling at unprecedented scale. The psychological cost of rule. Ancient sources describe Cambyses as increasingly unstable during this period. Whether these accounts are accurate or exaggerated by later writers, they reflect something real: the immense psychological burden of empire. Cambyses faced rebellion, distance, and constant pressure to prove legitimacy. Unlike his father, he had not built the empire. He had inherited it, and inheritance carries its own weight. The breaking point, as unrest spread, news reached Cambyses that a serious rebellion had erupted in Persia itself. This was no distant province. This was the empire's core. The challenge threatened the very foundation of Persian rule. Cambyses immediately began the return journey from Egypt, determined to restore order. But fate intervened. He would never reach home. The death of Cambyses. Cambyses died under unclear circumstances during the journey back to Persia. Some accounts suggest an accident. Others imply illness. A few hinted despair. What matters is not how he died, but when. His death occurred at the moment of greatest instability. The empire now faced its most serious crisis since its creation. An empire without a king, with Cambyses gone. Persia stood at a crossroads. Multiple claimants emerged. Rebellions intensified. Legitimacy was contested across the empire. This was the moment many empires collapse. The systems built by Cyrus were strong, but they had never faced this level of coordinated challenge. Persia's future now depended on whether a new leader could restore unity or whether the empire would fragment. A test of survival, this period revealed the truth about empire. Expansion is easier than endurance. The Persian Empire had conquered the world around it. Now it had to prove it could survive itself. The next ruler would not inherit stability. He would inherit crises, and his response would determine whether Persia would rise stronger or fall apart. Order restored. The rise of Darius when Cambyses II died. The Persian Empire stood on the edge of collapse. Across its vast territories, rebellions erupted almost simultaneously. Local rulers declared independence. False kings claimed legitimacy. The empire that had conquered the ancient world now struggled to hold itself together. What followed would determine whether Persia was a brief moment in history or a lasting civilization. A time of chaos in the months after Cambyses' death. Authority fragmented. Several individuals claimed the throne. Provinces refused to send tribute. Military commanders acted independently. This was not a single rebellion, it was a systemic breakdown. The Persian Empire had grown too large, too quickly, and without a clear line of uncontested succession, power slipped into uncertainty. But out of this chaos emerged one man, who was Darius. Darius was not the obvious heir. He was a member of the royal family, but not a direct successor. He was a capable military officer, experienced in administration and deeply familiar with imperial systems. More importantly, he understood one critical truth. Persia needed legitimacy as much as strength. Darius did not simply seize power. He justified it. Claiming the throne, Darius moved quickly. He eliminated rival claimants and presented himself as the rightful king. Chose not only by lineage, he framed his rule as the restoration of truth against deception. This narrative mattered. In an empire held together by diverse cultures, legitimacy was essential. Darius understood that people needed a reason to accept his authority beyond force. Crushing rebellion once crowned, Darius faced immediate resistance. Rebellions flared across Media, Babylon, Egypt, and other regions. Each threatened to fracture the empire permanently. Darius responded with decisive action. He personally led campaigns, moving rapidly from one crisis to another. His strategy was systematic. Defeat rebel leaders, restore local administration, and reassert central authority. Within a few years, the empire was brought back under control. This was not conquest, it was survival. Learning from crises, Darius did not simply suppress rebellion, he learned from it. He recognized that the empire's size required reform. Systems built for expansion were not sufficient for long-term governance. Darius began reorganizing the empire with a focus on stability. This marked a shift in Persian history, building a stronger state under Darius. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies. Each satrapy had a governor responsible for administration, a military commander responsible for security, and officials overseeing taxation. Power was deliberately divided. This reduced the risk of rebellion by preventing any one official from gaining too much control. It was one of the most advanced administrative systems of the ancient world. Law, order, and economy. Darius standardized laws across the empire while respecting local traditions. He introduced consistent taxation systems. He promoted trade. He invested in infrastructure, including roads and communication networks. The empire became not just powerful, but efficient. Messages could travel faster. Resources could be managed better. Authority became predictable rather than arbitrary. The king, as organizer, unlike Cyrus, who was a visionary founder, or Cambyses, who was a conqueror, Darius was an organizer. He transformed Persia from a collection of conquered lands into a functioning imperial state. This distinction mattered. Empires built on conquest alone rarely endure. Empires built on systems can last generations. Restoring confidence as stability returned. Loyalty followed. Provinces resumed tribute. Trade routes reopened. The population adapted to the new order. Darius did not erase the legacy of Cyrus. He preserved it and strengthened it. Persia emerged from crisis, not weakened, but transformed. The empire reborn by the end of Darius' consolidation. The Persian Empire was once again unified, but it was no longer the same empire Cyrus had founded. It was larger, more structured, more resilient. This transformation set the stage for Persia's greatest period of power and for its most famous conflicts. Looking forward with internal order restored, Persia now looked outward again. New ambitions would arise. New enemies would appear, and the empire would soon face challenges unlike any before. The age of consolidation was ending. The age of confrontation was about to begin. From scattered tribes to a united people, the Iranian Plateau had finally revealed what centuries of patience had prepared. Under Cyrus, the idea of empire was born built on tolerance, balance, and respect. Under Darius, that idea was given structure, laws, roads, administration, and order stretching across continents. Persia did not rise in a moment. It rose because it remembered what others forgot, that power must be guided and conquest must be governed. Now, the empire stands vast and confident, its borders touching seas and mountains, cultures and kingdoms. But greatness invites challenge, and beyond Persia's western horizon, new rivals are watching. In the next episode, we will step into Persia at its height, the age of Darius and Cyrus, and follow the empire as it faces its greatest test against the cities of Greece. Until then, let the echoes of the plateau remind us. History moves slowly, but when it moves, it changes the world.